justice. And I want to thank everyone for every single thing you've done, however small, writing postcards, making phone calls, donating money to push us to where we are today. We all know that the work isn't over yet, but I did want to take a moment to say, we did it, Joe. 2 years ago, it was inconceivable to me that we might flip the Senate, and here we are. And I'm so proud of us for all the work that we did, and I think we should celebrate. So I wanted to begin with a huge thank you and a Yahoo to everyone here. Our program today, as you well know, focuses on racial equity and justice. And if you look at the speaker list, you already know that it was an extraordinary amount of work to pull this together. I want to acknowledge Olivette Smith. This whole thing was her brainchild. She is the engine that led the train, and Lori Holzberg as well. She makes sure that we don't forget our deadlines and make sure that we're always on the Zoom calls and we have our Zoom links. So thank you, Lori, for your tireless work on this. The rest of the program committee is Stacey Ashland, Diane Rolfe, Emmy Thurber, Kristen Johnson, and Sarah Fields. Thanks for having a bunch of meetings about this. And I wanted to especially acknowledge Emily Ramos, who is behind the scenes making this whole event work, working her magic. It's a tough job, and we're so glad you're part of our team. As most of you know, the PDC, the Peninsula Democratic Coalition, we are a member organization. So if you have not renewed your membership for 2021 yet, I highly encourage you to do so. The vast majority of this money goes to Democratic candidates. We're all volunteers, so we try to be as thoughtful and strategic with money as we can be. I also wanted to thank the Los Altos Chamber for co-sponsoring this event, for telling your folks about it. I think as white people, the most impactful thing we can do is talk to our friends about racism and anti-Blackness in this country. I also wanted to say that we might go over time. I'm talking as fast as I can, but I know that there's a bunch of other people who have incredible things to share. So without further ado, Olivette, it's all you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for participating in our open and honest conversation about racism as rooted in the American culture. How racism and bias have shaped our lives on the peninsula as in other cities around the country. How such behaviors have manifested as systemic. We also wish to examine how to break the cycle, how to develop an individual and collective effort to becoming an anti-racist community. This conversation has two panels. The first will be our neighbors, the storytellers, sharing their experience of bias and racism. The second will be policymakers, whom are challenged to help breaking the links of systemic racism. I welcome all of you to please use the question and answer tab for any questions and comments to the panelists. And now I'd like to introduce our first panelist and moderator, Julie Lythcott-Haims, an educator and author in our community. Julie.
Thank you, Olivette. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you and your colleagues here today. I am a Palo Alto resident. I have owned a home here since the year 2000. I'm an author. I've written a book on what it's like to be Black and biracial in white spaces. And I get to go around the country talking about, whoops, I'm supposed to be the timekeeper and I've already forgotten to start timing myself. So here I go. I'm trying to keep myself now to about 3 minutes, 30 seconds. I get to go around the country talking about the experiences I've had, but there is no greater honor than when your own community says, hey, would you join us for a conversation? So I am deeply honored to be here and grateful to everyone who planned this and to the over 180 people who are watching us right now and the many who will be tuning in later. So we're gonna have a storyteller panel first, as Olivette said, and there are 5 of us on that panel. I've been asked to kick it off. And first, however, I'm gonna just briefly introduce my fellow panelists. They are Nathasha Mejia. Nathasha is a Palo Alto native, currently resides in Berkeley. and is a policy analyst for the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform in Oakland. After Nathasha will be Lucinda Tinsman. Lucinda was an English and music major, got a master's in teaching, has been a language arts teacher for many, many years, and resides in the Willows in Menlo Park. Following Lucinda, we'll have Nehezi Roberts. Nehezi is the former associate professor of English at the City College of Chicago. She is now a clinical social worker, consultant, and her work is national. She's also been quite close to home here at the Lucille Packard Children's Hospital. She is also a resident of the Willows in Menlo Park. And last but not least, my friend, Dr. Terri Givens, a political scientist, the former provost at Menlo College, and the CEO and founder of Brighter Higher Ed. She is a resident of West Menlo Park. So those are my fellow panelists, and the remainder of my time, I will share briefly about myself. I am a Black and biracial person who's grown up all over the United States. I grew up relatively privileged. My father was a physician in public health, quite prominent in the Carter administration. My mother has a PhD in science education. I come from privileged people. I've got this very light skin, was raised middle class, and then became upper middle class. And yet, I very much experienced racism and microaggressions, as we now call them. And these things harmed me. I went from the sort of innocence as a child to discovering at about age 3 or 4 that something was wrong with my Black daddy and probably with me. I could tell that based on the looks in the eyes of strangers when we walked down the street. And so I plunged into this place of self-loathing, believing the racism, believing the stereotypes, feeling I really had nowhere to turn when these things happened. I just ingested it, digested it, and it really shaped my sense of self. So although I was outwardly successful, brand name college, law school, I became a lawyer here in Palo Alto at a law firm, became a dean at Stanford. I was really in this place of self-loathing, just trying to never be called the N-word again, as happened to me in my high school, my all-white high school on my 17th birthday. And ultimately, I emerge out of this place of self-loathing to a place of self-love, which I'm delighted to have inhabited now for 10 or 12 years, having undone the effects, the pernicious effects that racism and microaggressions had on me. So just a few brief stories. Let's see, as I'm conscious that I've already used up my 4 minutes. But I think the next person isn't slated to go for another 2 minutes. So I think we started, I'll tell you what, I won't tell any of my stories. I'm gonna make room for everybody else. And if there's room at the end of this panel, then I'll share some of mine with you. So Nathasha, you're on.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nathasha Mejia. I am a Palo Alto native and I currently reside in Berkeley. I will start off by telling you a little bit about myself and my experience living in Palo Alto as a young Black woman. I too am biracial. My mom is white, my dad is Black. However, I was never seen as being anything but a Black person. And that played a huge role in my life. So I remember the first time experiencing racism. I was in kindergarten, and I remember feeling so sad and confused because 2 white children didn't want to play with me because of the color of my skin. Later on in elementary school, a boy yelled at me on the playground and called me an African long neck. These acts of discrimination did not just stop at peers, but it was with my teachers as well. I was made to feel stupid. I was more harshly punished than my white peers, and I was overlooked. Sorry, I didn't expect to get so emotional. But I was made to feel stupid. I was more harshly punished than my white peers, and I was overlooked. Experiences like these made me internalize that Black was less than, that I was less than. I did not perform well in school, and I ultimately dropped out of Gunn High School and attended Alta Vista, which is a continuation high school in Mountain View, where very sadly, a lot of other Black and brown students end up going. Later on in college, I learned about a social phenomenon called the stereotype threat, which is a social psychological predicament that can arise from negative stereotypes about one's own group and puts people at risk of conforming as a self-characteristic to that negative stereotype. So this predicament is a contributing factor to a longstanding racial and gender gaps in academic performances, and really shed light as to why I struggled academically in school and with developing my own identity. Furthermore, from the time I was in high school up until today, Black people in Palo Alto, including myself, have been disproportionately pulled over, harassed, and discriminated against by police. For those of you who can't imagine that police in the peninsula would take part in this, I recently attended a webinar series on cannabis equity and racial justice, which provided statistics on racial disparities and showed that Black people in Palo Alto are 26 times more likely to be arrested for weed-related charges. I won't go into all the times where police have used excessive force on my peers and discriminated against us. But I will say that when I was just 13 years old at a Lacy dance in Los Altos, a white police officer arrested me, the only Black child out of an all-white group of kids, after ditching the dance. I want people to know and understand how systemic racism affects the lives of people of color. I want them to understand the root causes of oppression and how and why it lingers today. I also ask that people actively challenge their racial biases. I want policymakers to take into account how the history of oppression and racism is directly tied to current policies. I want them to know we need concrete policy action and systemic change that rectifies the harm done to Black people and other people of color in areas of investment, housing, education, healthcare, jobs, and the criminal justice system. Finally, I'll say that my experience with discrimination really ignited my passion to combat social injustices. Currently, I'm a policy analyst at the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, where I coordinate legislative and policy initiatives and conduct research on policies, programs, strategies, and organizations in the fields of criminal and juvenile justice, youth development, violence reduction, and organizational development. I received my bachelor's from UC Berkeley in social welfare and my master's in social work from Columbia University. I hope that my brief story helps people understand a little more about what people of color go through in the peninsula. And I just wanted to let people know that there's a really amazing podcast out there called 1619 that aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the United States national narrative. It's a really great way to just get another perspective of the history and why systemic racism exists. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Natasha. And you're not alone in having emotion around these stories. We're really grateful that you've chosen to share them with all of us today. And thank you so much for that. Moving on, we now have Lucinda Tinsman.
Hello, I'm Lucinda Tinsman. I have a master's in education and I taught violin and wait, I'm looking at myself. Is there any way I can not do that? Okay.
You can hit gallery view. If you hit gallery view, you'll see all of us in small squares and you won't be so big on your own screen.
I don't think, I don't know how to do this.
Just focus on your webcam. Just look into your webcam and you can ignore your own.
Okay, that's better. So I've been teaching violin here for 15 years. I mean, the reason I was brought here today to talk was just that there was a specific incident that happened that involved my family that, you know, I'd like to share and that really focused my concern on this issue. So, you know, over the summer, there was a lot of demonstrating for Black Lives Matter. And, you know, we didn't participate because we were worried about getting the virus. But I was just very much behind this, and I was glad that this was happening. And I thought that there was a lot of awareness just in the air about this issue. And we have an autistic son, and he's 6, and it was kind of a problem with the shutdown, having somebody help for him. So I found this wonderful behavioral therapist who works in the Palo Alto School District, Ethan Thompson, and he worked with us, all year, every single day, being the behavioral therapist with my son, Kieran. And he, in the course of being the behavioral therapist, he's Black. He has earrings. I guess he has braids, but this was not had anything to do with why we hired him. What ended up happening, so every single day he would walk with my son in the neighborhood holding his hand. And I think most of the neighbors in the Willows were familiar with him. But for whatever reason, one day on Oak Court, a police car pulled up to investigate what had taken place. And when Ethan came home and told me about this, and then I saw something on Nextdoor about this, and I gradually realized that, this had been, well, so I just have to say my son acts out a lot of the time. And, he'll have temper tantrums, but it just so happened that he was not acting out at this point. So it seems evident that this was a situation where there was either conscious or unconscious bias involved in whoever on Oak Court called the police to say that this gentleman who's just walking hand in hand with my child, who is white, not having a temper tantrum, was somehow something that deserved investigation. So, I guess my thinking, well, one thing I just have to say, Ethan was just unfazed. He didn't even tell me about this until a week later, because he'd had this happen so many times to him. And but I guess what I want to get to before my time is cut off is that I think it's amazing that there's no transparency, that there was no way for me to find out who made this call. Anybody can call, it can be racism, it could be unconscious bias, whatever it is. Nobody in the community can find out about who made any of these phone calls. And so I guess my suggestion would be that there either be transparency, so that if somebody make a frivolous phone call, to report somebody who's doing something that, is completely what they should be doing, that, there's some ability to know who that is in the community, or that the police who answer the phone call have some sort of screening questions for the possibility of it being an unconscious bias type situation. And it just I don't know how I am doing on time, but Ethan had just told us after this event that this has just colored his whole career, where he's had this happen so many times, and he's lost so many jobs because of this, that when they asked him to go back and work in person in the Palo Alto School District, he kind of wanted to stay with us, but he had to go with them because he's never had a job before where he feels secure and he likes his, the people that he works with. And so he just was afraid that that would be his only opportunity. So anyway, that's my story.
Lucinda, thank you so much for sharing that with us. We appreciate it. Nehezi Roberts, you're next.
Hello. I'm not sure if I can see myself. Oh, there we go. So I'm Nehezi. I'm very new to Menlo Park, been here probably a year, but before moving to the Willows, I was in a hotel for quite some time in Menlo Park for work. And we'll get back to that. So ever since I stepped foot in Menlo Park, I've had, a lot of questions, a lot of concerns, and very few assumptions, because I don't like to do that. So I would like to just start by just something I wrote when I first got here, and it's called Enter Menlo Park. Enter Menlo Park, my skin color is my resume, my CV, and my cover letter. My skin color is criminal and triggering. My skin color is a trigger to those with less melanin. My skin color welcomes violent threats, cruel name calling. My skin color welcomes defacing of Black Lives Matter signs and theft of property. When I entered the world, I thought people saw me as resilient, saw me as beautiful, saw me as welcoming, disarming. And unfortunately, since being here, that's not so true. So my story starts with a very frustrating night, and I decided to post an open letter on Nextdoor. It was an open letter to Menlo Park. And I had an overwhelming response. I should also say that I thought only maybe 5 people who respond offer to bake me some bread and we just move on with it. But no. So I would say most people were very warm, but I definitely experienced some not so warm people with comments such as, perhaps if you went to a better school, you could get a job here. Or perhaps if your school was, Ivy League or great, you can get a job here. So a neighbor defended me and said, I thought Stanford and U Chicago are both ranked 6. Thank you, neighbor. I also have experienced the police coming to our door because we were playing music, because COVID will drive you crazy. But someone said there was domestic violence. I'm like, anything violent about this is maybe how people perceive music that maybe is an ear sore to them, but it sounds beautiful to me, as I am a daughter of a jazz vocalist and a daughter of a teacher. So every time when aggression meets me, I meet it with patience. I meet it with love. And so if I was going to say, what do I want people with different life experiences from me to know or not do? First thing we can do is stop calling me a Black American. I'm an American. If I'm a Black American, explain to me why. Because if you can't call me a caramel colored American or, brown sugar American, I'll take that. But when we use these labels and use census, it's not useful for me and people that look like me that are trying to do what the me's are doing. So if I want to talk to policymakers, I and so many people like me do not need another Boys and Girls Club. We do not need another welfare to work program. We need lanes opened to create wealth. We're missing 10 generations of people that have, in my opinion, benefited off of the work of my ancestors. And if I also wanted to add something to that, I would say, why can't we initiate a city-sponsored, initiated reparations? The city I'm from, Evanston, Illinois, has done so. I think we can do the work. We don't have to rely on the federal government to dictate how our city runs. And we also cannot let people that do not like or think they do not like Black people have their voice louder than the voices that are humanitarians, because we're all human. Only race I belong to is a human race. We probably will never agree. And that's what I have to say. And Evanston's like Menlo Park. Menlo Park's like Evanston. We don't plan to leave. We plan to do the work. So please embrace us.
Nehezi, thank you so much for sharing that. And finally, we have Dr. Terri Givens.
Thanks so much. My story begins in Spokane, Washington, which is when I was growing up in the 60s and early 70s, was not less than 1% Black. So, being in spaces like Menlo Park is not unusual for me. But my story here actually began in 1983 when I started at Stanford University as a first generation undergrad. And I'm the youngest of 7 children. And, my parents were, my mom especially was part of the Great Migration from Louisiana to Los Angeles. And, one of the things I've been doing a great deal of in the last few years is delving more into my own family history and trying to understand the connections and so on. But one of the things that really jumped out at me when I was thinking about my story, and I think this ties very much also to Julie's stories, is, this internalized oppression that we feel. And so when I was growing up, my parents really tried to assimilate and have us be assimilated and so on. And it does help, develop that issue of self-loathing. But I really felt like I moved past that, after Stanford. But one of the things I noted when I was at Stanford was this divide between, one side of the freeway and the other. And I did spend some time in East Palo Alto then. I lived there during a summer and so on. And that really haunted me for, I left California after finishing my PhD at UCLA and lived back in Washington State and then in Texas. And so, but I really wanted to get back to California for a variety of reasons. And the job at Menlo College came up. And so when we moved back here, I really wanted to get involved and engaged in the community because my sons go to Menlo Atherton High School, and the divides there are just so pervasive. And the way that the students come in and from Ravenswood School District and don't have the same advantages that the kids like even my own sons have living here in West Menlo Park. And so there's a lot of issues I could talk about, but one of my big concerns has been for my sons, and the fact that I have to talk to them about going out at night in a hoodie, things like that. I really worry. Somebody mentioned next door. People are talking all the time about profiling people on Nextdoor and so on, and so it's really frustrating to live in this neighborhood. I have wonderful neighbors, but it can be really frightening for a mother to worry about what's going to happen, especially to boys. And so, even though my boys are mixed race, they're darker skinned, so they do get profiled. And but it's also, what happens to them, the microaggressions at school. I remember Brandon started out at Hillview, and the teachers there assumed he was a Tinsley transfer, and I didn't even know what the Tinsley program was when I first got here. But there's the problem is all these assumptions people are making, right? And so I have a book that I'll put here, but I tell a lot of my stories in this book because one of the problems is that people need to have, I talk about radical empathy, but it's really important that we understand that we all have these biases. That's why this internalized oppression occurs, because we have internalized the biases that are around us. And so if we don't all understand that we're living in this sea of bias, it was very interesting. I was listening to the program they did recently on the segregation in Menlo Park. And so if you don't understand that the reason there aren't, there's only a handful of us here in, West Menlo Park and Menlo Park more generally, is because of the history, then, you can't understand why we can't just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. It's not that easy. And we all have to do more to make sure that we are, making sure that people have access, that we and reparations actually is a good place to start. But I will leave it there.
Thank you, Terri. We're going to head into questions from the audience. I was expected to add some of my stories too, but we didn't build in time for me to do the introductions and whatnot on top of that. So let me just give 1 minute's worth of stories. I've been followed around at Stanford Shopping Center. I've been asked for ID at Safeway when the white person before me writing a check didn't get asked for ID. I was a 7-year-old in a pool and some parent hauled their white kid out of the pool because a black kid was in it. I attended a fundraiser for Juana Briones Elementary School. My kids attended that school here in Palo Alto Unified, was attending a fundraiser and a backyard party. And a woman showed up in blackface, for real, in Palo Alto, sometime in the last 10 years. And I almost vomited. And I scanned my eyes for anybody else who could relate to the horror. And I just saw a lot of drunk white people laughing. And I left the party and I made a bit of noise about it. And I was made to feel that I was the one who had overreacted. And to this day, I really haven't had any white person in the community say, I am really sorry that happened to you. I'm really sorry that that is happening here in our town. So blackface in Palo Alto, who'd have thought, but here it is. Let's turn over to questions. I think Stacy and Sarah are funneling questions by way of the Q&A that y'all have submitted. Why don't I ask each panelist to unmute? And that way we don't all have to answer every question, but let's jump in if you feel it pertains to you or if it's specifically for you. No questions in the Q&A yet. All right, folks. So please submit your questions.
A question.
There we go. Yeah.
One of the most disturbing challenges we've had, my partner and I, we identify as a heterosexual couple. We use the term partner because we like to be inclusive. Therefore, our landlord has asked us to leave. She assumes we have a dog somehow. So she wants to evict us because of our dog. We don't have a dog. Not that I know of. She has harassed, there's been a rope outside of our home. And when asked if she could remove it, she gave us so much HE double hockey sticks. So I'm just trying to understand, what the goal is of the harassment when it comes to housing. Because I'm never going to meet aggression with aggression because I wasn't taught that. I'm going to defend myself, but it's becoming hard to defend yourself against everyone. So I just think that, a lot of work needs to be done. I think even in terms of politics, I think new blood needs to be seen so we can start having some new voices and new concerns. And just to relate with Nathasha, when I was in kindergarten, I was called an African booty scratcher. I had to go home and ask what that was. And from that to your lips are so big, it could cool soups. And this was my beginning. But fortunately, I have very strong parents, but even the strongest parents, they're not at school with you. They're not, in college with you. The first time I was called a nigger was in college in Georgia. And I was shocked. And I confronted the man until my friends told me I'm not being smart. And, they lynched in Georgia, and that's disturbing. So I'm rambling, but I wanted to hear other people's experience about housing and the inaffordability. And, if you walk by someone's house, when I take a walk, everyone wants to come outside and ask me what I'm up to. Same thing you are, trying to survive COVID.
Right. Thank you for that, Nehezi. We're going to get to policy questions. I think housing is going to come up there. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. So let's go there. What have you seen as your response? And this also does relate to what Nehezi just shared. What have you seen as the response when you call out racism from non-people of color?
I mentioned that because in the chat, but basically I call it gaslighting because people say, no, that they didn't mean it that way, or, you should just ignore it. It's, move on. And part of the problem is that's why racism persists, right? Because we're expected to just let it roll off our backs and move on and forget about it. And that's something that I really have had to work on, because I think, if we're, we have to call people out on it, but we also have to explain why. We shouldn't have to do that, but unfortunately, sometimes you have to explain. Another question I can see is, what blackface means to us. Well, blackface is to put it bluntly, violence. I mean, it's basically somebody saying, diminishing who we are. And if you understand the history of it and the way that it was utilized in the early 1900s in particular, then you would understand that this is it's worse than cultural appropriation. And to me, it's a symbol of violence.
All right.
Could I just say something about just the conversation that happened on Nextdoor after the event? Because I think that was part of why I was brought in. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Just take a minute. We don't want to hold up the next panel. But
sure,
please
I'll be fast. So after this event happened with the BT Ethan, I posted on Nextdoor, hey guys, this is an obvious example of racism. And I think the thing that was almost worse than what happened was, I got the first 10 comments or first 5 comments all seemed to be from people of color. And I was like, where are the allies in this conversation? And I would say like 50% of the comments to like the story I put out there was just gaslighting and like, oh, it probably wasn't racism, let's find an excuse for why this happened. And I'm kind of shocked that there's a lot of racism, I believe, on Nextdoor. There's a lot of entitlement on Nextdoor, and that there's no filter for this, you know, and just the conversation that sort of erupted after this. So.
All right.
Can I include I'm not going to go into the details, but I saw in the Q&A that people wanted some more clarification on what reparations would look like. And if you go online and type in the Black New Deal, there's some websites that'll pop up in what reparations kind of would look like and how we can target those root causes of oppression and how we can build agency in our communities. Also, in terms of blackface, I mentioned that podcast 1619. There's a specific podcast episode that does talk about blackface. Yeah, I would just encourage people to do some of their own digging and research into those.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your sharing your stories. Back over to you, Olivette.
So right now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a 30-second break. Take a deep breath, and we will then begin with part 2 of our conversation, our panelists, the policymakers. Policymakers, are we ready? Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you the moderator for the policymakers, a current member of the City Council of Menlo Park, Ray Mueller. Ray, to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. And thank you to our prior panel. Your stories are so incredibly powerful and impactful. In June of 2020, Vice President Harris, then Senator Harris, wrote the following in a nationally published op-ed. Let's speak the truth. People are protesting because Black people have been treated as less than human in America, because our country has never fully addressed the systemic racism that has plagued our country since its earliest days. It is the duty of every American to fix. No longer can some wait on the sidelines hoping for incremental change. In times like this, silence is complicity. The struggle against racism, both systemic and overt, has a long and distinguished history of leaders and community here in the Bay Area, and specifically on the peninsula. Today, we have an outstanding panel of local policymakers and community leaders who have been asked to share their stories and their thoughts and reflections in their work overcoming racism in our community. We are grateful to have with us former mayor and East Palo Alto City Council member, Lythcott Gauthier, former mayor and Belmont City Council member, Davina, Los Altos mayor, Neysa Fligor, and Palo Alto Human Rights Commissioner from the University AME Zion Church, Reverend Kaloma Smith. The organizers of the event have asked policymakers on the panel to reflect on the stories shared in the prior panel and share their truths in the following topic areas. First, what is the one thing you've seen change for the better in the past year or recent years regarding racism in our community? 2, what do you see as the highest priority challenge we must address locally? And 3, how can members of our community help you do your jobs better to affect this kind of change? After each of the panelists shares with us, there'll be an opportunity for audience members to ask the questions of the panel. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Mayor and East Palo Alto City Council member, Lythcott Gauthier.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the PDC for putting this event together. Again, my name is Lythcott Gauthier, a longtime resident of East Palo Alto and proud mother of 3 young adults. When I think about what has changed over the year, or what has been one of the biggest impacts for me, there have been a few things. But one thing that I will call out is that the death of George Floyd last year brought so much attention to an event that has been happening, or things that have been happening in our community for decades. There have been young African-American men and women that have died at the hands of those who are supposed to protect and serve them for the longest time. And that didn't happen. It happened during a time, not that it was a good news, but it happened during a time in our country when everybody was in the right place, standing still, paying attention, and we're not looking at anything else. It was the one thing that you had to see. This man put his knee on another man's neck until the life left that man, the other man's body. So what it caused is for all of us to come together to protest. And those who protested in the beginning didn't just look like one race. It was a melting pot of people who figured out that this was an issue and a big problem and something that they wanted to see fixed. That brings me to my own story. You know, I'm a mother of 3 young adults. I have a son who is in his 30s. And the pain that a mother feels, that many may feel, mothers of color, when my son came to me and said, "Mom, why did God make me Black?" Not because he's not loved in his own family, but it was the choices and the treatment that he received outside of our household. You know, it came a time when my son wouldn't even look at his face in the mirror. He goes, "Mom, I go places and I get stopped for no reason. I wear a hoodie because that's what I want to wear." And I heard Dr. Terri Givens talk about the hoodie. It is something that our young men like to wear, and they shouldn't be punished because that is the way that they wear their attire. So while the George Floyd brought some attention, we have not resolved what this police brutality actually means and what it's doing in our communities. Again, I'm not the only mother who's raising children, who pains and was afraid that each time your child leaves the house, are they going to come home after they go home, they leave the house? I have to have these conversations, not necessarily with my daughters, but with my son. I would always have to say, make smart choices, son, because I want you to come home. And it wasn't just on him, but it's just the way things have gone. So that is something that I think is huge and something that we need to continue to have conversations about. And it is too bad that different sides will take police brutality and they will divide it and make it something that it really shouldn't be. We should be having conversations about how we're going to police our communities, how our community members are going to be protected, how our loved ones are going to be able to go out and come home. Because even if they're committing a crime, they should be able to come home and they should be able to be represented and face a jury of their peers. No one should be able to execute them on the street. So what should we do about it? Have real conversations. Let's sit down and have a real conversation of what this looks like in our community, not just in our community, but all over. And let's try to repair it and fix it and build bridges and make sure that it doesn't happen anymore. And when you think about the community members came and they showed up for us. And I'm proud to know that community members showed up. I think about Alana Stevens, who is a teenager at Menlo Atherton who formed a protest, and others who protested. But it's going to take police sitting down to talk about how we're going to fix this. And it's going to take others to have a real conversation about implicit biases and other things that lead to this behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Gauthier. Our next panelist is former Mayor and Belmont City Council Member Davina Hurt.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here with all of you, and with the pandemic and being a person of color, I don't say this lightly. I once read, we don't need miracles to change the world, we only need each other. And this is a time now more than ever that we speak power to truth here. I actually would like to start a little bit off with experience of racism and bias in the community, and then go into the 3 questions that were asked of us. And at first I would say it was really hard to answer this question. I can tell you individual stories, like I was introduced as a mayor and they assumed I was from a particular city here on the peninsula. And when I told them I actually was the mayor of Belmont, the comment was, well, don't you have to live in Belmont? Well, guess what? I can live in Belmont too. I went for a walk. I got back home to find out from my significant other that I was being talked about on Nextdoor. There you go, Nextdoor. He said, what was going on? People were typing in, there's a Black lady walking around I've never seen before. Does anybody know who she is? Where is she from? It's your council member. These are stories, and you've heard them before. They're typical stories. You know, we can talk about abhorrent names we've been called. We can talk about being suspect of being up to no good. And it's not one act, it's the totality of actions, and they can be very subtle. And I think about James Baldwin, a poet that said to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all the time. And it's in one's work. And part of the rage is this: it's not only happening to me, it's happening to my family, it's happening to my neighbors, all around us all the time. But you still have to function. You still have to function at 110%. And you're told, don't talk about it. We're past that. Well, we're not past it. I have to say that my mother and my mother's mother have trained me early on to regulate this emotion of injustice and actually focus on community action and make a difference in our lives. And so this is what brings me to serve at the City of Belmont. Positive change. There has been positive change. There's a willingness to talk about it beyond the usual groups or identities. The doors have been open unlike any time before. And some people have actually named themselves a group where they're talking about anti-racism in their communities, and others informally are gathering and talking about it. I have a friend, however, who is a strong Republican who said to me that racism only occurs when we talk about it. It's from the past. And I had to tell my friend, actually, no, this is something we need to embrace. And in the same stream of thought, I've had individuals who are very outspoken about their prejudices, and hiding and being secretive is no longer what's happening. It's there's a real tension in our communities. And there's also the thought, I'm not racist, but I believe X, Y, and Z, that is racist. And so to me, we have to get to the work of dismantling what is systematic and institutionalized racism that is so pervasive and prevalent. The biggest challenge is doing just that. How do we dismantle without blowing up society? How do we bring everybody along? This is the difficulty that leaders like myself and others on this panel have to deal with. Well, one thing we need to do is start by putting mirrors up to ourselves. You know, we're Democrats, liberal, progressive, we think as we are, but we still have issues, as has been spoken about earlier. These problems started way before George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmed, and in San Mateo County, Chinadu. Then I'm learning about his story, and I too have to question. Unintentional messages we send. We need to protect people who challenge the system. And sometimes some of these people look like me and other times they don't, but if uplift those voices. Last, I'll just say, because I can talk on and on, you know, how do we achieve this? I think we have to keep having civil, courageous conversations. We have to continue working on our self-awareness. Sometimes, actually all the time, we need to call out racism when we see it. And I'm going to uplift Ibram X. Kendi's work that talks about challenging racism before it starts. It's not just about police violence, it's healthcare, it's job opportunity and wealth, it's the educational system, it's housing, it's the environment. How can you pull yourself up by your bootstraps when you don't have boots and you don't have shoelaces? These are the things as leaders we need to work on. And I'm happy to be in the place that I am for not only my city, but also for those in the state. And I'm gonna zip it now because I saw Julie's face again. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Councilmember Hurt. Next, we'll hear from Mayor Fligor.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, former mayors Hurt and Gauthier. Such a pleasure and honor to be sharing this virtual stage with these esteemed panelists and to listen to the powerful stories that we heard earlier. As Ray said, I am the mayor of Los Altos. And for those of you who are not familiar with Los Altos, I just want to give you some demographic context. We have around 30,000 residents, and of the 30,000, less than 1% of individuals identify as Black or African American. And so if you do the math, that's around 150 individuals. And so that is the context of, you know, the different things I will share with this group today. Similar to other cities and what we heard from the other panelists, triggered and motivated by what happened with George Floyd last year, George Floyd's murder. At our council meeting, we started having residents showing up, speaking up, amplifying their voices about their own experience and treatment from police officers based on the color of their skin. A lot of these speakers were students, either current or former students at our Los Altos High School. And I can tell you, most of the stories we heard, we had not heard before. And so when we talk about last year and COVID and everything else that happened, you know, it was a sad time. It was an unprecedented year, and I'm sure we wish it all didn't happen. But for me, that was actually one of the positive things that came out of 2020, which it really amplified and motivated a lot of our young residents to speak up. In response to that, our council held a town hall where we invited residents, you know, and obviously non-residents also showed up because we wanted to hear directly from them, their experiences, to see if there was anything we could do as leaders in the community. There were a lot of issues raised at the town hall, and as a result, the former mayor, Jan Pepper, and I were assigned to a policing task force, and we appointed 9 Los Altos residents to serve on this task force. And as part of the task force, we had 2 captains that would attend our task force meetings to respond to what they were hearing. And out of that task force, we implemented 5 things, or we gave direction related to 5 areas. 1, the full council eliminated the current SRO program, the School Resource Officer program at Los Altos High. We also moved up the timetable for the police department to get the RIPA system so we could get better data about arrests. The council also directed staff to improve the citizens complaint process because we heard a lot of concern about people not feeling comfortable calling the police to complain about the police. And we also had our police officers incorporate additional implicit bias training into their curriculum, so going above and beyond what was required. And I am very proud of our community for taking those steps, but as you heard today, there's still a lot to be done. And so where we go from here, not just as Los Altos, but as a community, is to ensure that we continue listening to our residents. When we implement policies and programs like Los Altos did, we have to make sure we follow through. We measure those programs to make sure they're effective, they're working, and they're addressing the issues we had heard. We need to create a safe space for our residents so they know they will be listened to, they will be heard. And we don't just put it on a shelf, but we actually talk about what actions can we take as your representatives, as your leaders, to ensure that you, regardless if you're a minority in the community, that you feel equally valued. When I serve on boards, regional boards related to healthcare, housing, the environment, I'm always cognizant and aware of the different voices so that different perspectives and voices can be represented at the table. And I think that's what is expected of us as policymakers and leaders in our community. Yeah, I don't know how many of you are familiar with what's going on right now with the different jurisdictions getting their housing allocation. It's called, RENA. Mm-hmm. One of the positive things from RENA for this next cycle is that one of the factors is affirmatively furthering housing. And that is an acknowledgement that in our housing policies going forward, we have to make sure as a priority, increasing diversity in different areas of our community so we can all have access to high resource areas and assets is available to all. And so I do think as leaders, policymakers, and as community members, we all have a role to play in this. And I see the time because I was sure a story, many residents last year when the stories were shared at council meetings and then the task force, I can tell you some of the residents who were treated poorly and discriminated against, they actually said, they shared with me that they were pleasantly surprised about how supportive the Los Altos community was once they heard their stories. And so just being that voice and support will help them to further amplify their voices and bring about the change we need. So thank you again for joining this important conversation. This is one of the many steps we need to take. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Fligor. And now I turn to Reverend Kaloma Smith.
Hi, I don't know what I can add to this distinguished body. I mean, my fellow Jamaican, Mayor Neysa Fligor, she really laid it out. But to answer the questions, the one thing that I think has been positive has been the peeling back of the myth of this liberal bastion with no racism. We are now at a point where we realize that there is active and high levels of racism in our area. When you look at the responses on Nextdoor, when you look at the responses on the Daily Post, when you look at the responses in the newspapers, when you look at the verbal bullying that happens at school board meetings, when you look when policy things happen and you have call-ins, what we are seeing now, and this is one of the things that are critical about COVID, more people are watching local politics, and the foolishness and the downright biased racism that was there before is now to be seen. Now, what is the biggest challenge to solve in our area? We need to stop treating Black and brown people like everybody's broke, everybody's uneducated, and every issue around Black and brown people are around crime, needing a handout, or needing the city to do something for them. The reality is we have lawyers, doctors, entrepreneurs, people that are working at the highest level of Google and Facebook. And every time we talk about treating Black and brown people right, they bring it to a conversation of poverty, drugs, and arrest. We just did a report for the Palo Alto Human Relations Commission. In the city of Palo Alto last year, we had 18 hate-based incidents. The only Black candidate for City Hall had a White Lives Matter sign on her thing. We had a Black Lives Matter thing that was done by high school students, desecrated. We had 2 churches that had spray paint or signs written out. Churches. Like at some point, this is not Alabama. This is not the Deep South. I grew up in New York, and even the gang members knew not to go close to the churches. Think about the mindset of someone that is willing to go onto church property to rip a sign or spray paint it. I need us at this point, as we start talking about policies, let's talk about some critical policies. The first thing is we need from our local police radical transparency. We need real data. We need the police unions to stop hiding bad actors. We need the chiefs to start suspending officers that have a constant record. We need that. I've sat at enough tables and we get some, but we don't get that change that says we're holding officers accountable. We also need to hold our community accountable. 70 to 80% of the calls that happen in the city of Palo Alto for the police department are started by citizens. I see a Black person. I don't know how many people, I don't know this group that's walking in the park. Do they have a permit? All of these other things. And the community is basically perpetrating phone violence and having the police enforce it against Black and brown individuals in our communities. There has to be a consequence at some level to say, if you make these false calls, what is the consequence? A Black person walking or a Latinx person walking or a Pacific Islander walking in your neighborhood is not a crime. We live in America. Thank you.
You're the only one to end right on time. You can take another wrap up in 30 seconds.
Okay, I'll wrap up at 30 seconds. How can we do, we need to have conversations, but we as a community need to start holding the bad actors on Nextdoor, on the newspapers, in the city council. We need to hold them accountable because we can't be a fair and just society if we start demeaning other people that are divinely created by God. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Smith. So I have a number of questions that have come through via the chat, and what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and put them out there, and if a panelist member wants to answer them, please take them. The first question is, how do we hold elected officials accountable for racist, personal, and/or professional conduct? What can or should be done? Reverend Smith.
So you need to call them on it at the time. We were in a city council meeting. I'm surprised they invited me back after this, but we were talking about police reform, and one of the ladies started talking about what happens if somebody comes into town that's on drugs and this and that. I'm like, we live in Palo Alto, not the South Bronx. You're using this boogeyman of violence from Black and Latinx to push against police reforms. And we need to call them, whether it's in the paper, whether it's at the council meeting, whether it's comments, whether it's writing letters, whether it's organizing people to vote against them if they have a pattern of it, because this behavior is unacceptable. And we tolerate this low grade fever of bias from our council members because they're appealing to a certain group that they know we're watching.
If I can follow up, and also holding them accountable is making sure that they create the policy to have a solution and fix what it is that is a problem in the community, and following and tracking that policy making. Because it's very easy for us as politicians to say many things that sound good at the moment, but at the end of the day, what is it that we accomplish? What is it that we do together, and holding them for it? And then if they don't, I guess you don't vote them back in.
Thank you. Thank you both. Our next question is, with the next RHNA cycle numbers, out of a need for almost 500,000 new units in the Bay Area, along with an understanding of racial codes, white, Protestants only, in the past, should there be a push for building multifamily housing across the peninsula, both as an answer to racism of the past and creating a more equitable community?
I can take that one, Ray. I think we won't have a choice. As some of us are already familiar, the state laws coming out of Sacramento going back a couple of years, and more we expect this year because some were put on hold because of COVID last year, we won't have a choice. And so right now, as jurisdictions are going through updating their housing element, what that process requires us to do is to look at our zoning codes and determine what changes do we need to make in order to meet these RHNA allocation numbers assigned to our jurisdiction. And if you put pen to paper, there's no way it pencils out with only single family homes.
Right, and I would thank you. The same thing there. We have to be accountable and build the housing. You know, cities like East Palo Alto cannot be the housing that creates all the affordable housing. It has to be spread out and has to be equitable. People should feel comfortable living in any city on the peninsula and feel welcome at the same time. So housing has to be show some equity on it.
The other thing I think that's absolutely critical for our area to understand is we can no longer benefit from being a world-class technical hub. We can no longer benefit from having a university and then want to be a small Midwest town. The benefits of having Silicon Valley here, the benefits of having Stanford University here, there's a responsibility with that, and that's creating housing and stuff around it. It is not just their neighborhood for rich people. And this is the thing that I think people are going to see after this pandemic is over. Your housing values are going to sink because you spent years fighting it. And now companies say, I refuse to pay a line person $80,000. I'll pay him $55,000 in Austin. The party is going to end, and we need real housing reform that meets real people.
Thank you. So we have another question. Some of the momentum from last summer seems to have faded. How do we keep racial justice, and more specifically, policy goals like the elimination of no-walk warrants at the forefront?
Well, I think having talks like this, and not just during Black History Month, but all the time, is really important. Hearing from faces that look like myself, the issues that we're trying to champion in our communities, supporting those are really important. For me, I have a focus right now on the environment. We talked about housing, redlining. You know, a lot of people of color are around stationary sources, purposely put into places and areas where they are worse with health outcomes. We need to change policies around that and do that for everyone all the time. And so you will, I think, hear all of us just talking all the time about the issues that matter. And that's how we keep the momentum going.
And I will just add to Mayor Hurt's point, where it ties back to the accountability question, where to keep the momentum going, you really have to hold us accountable. So for example, I mentioned some policies we implemented last year, and I do think we have a responsibility that the community and residents who also care about these issues as our partners should make sure that these issues stay top of mind, and we're doing all the things that we said we were going to do, and they're addressing the concerns that they were intended to address. Because then if not, then you look at, okay, is there more that needs to happen? It's not necessarily, you know, oh, we did something, that's it. No, we need to partner together to make sure that these issues stay top of mind and we're actually finding solutions that work.
Well said. Well said.
And Ray, if I can add, I mean, my two colleagues have said it so eloquently, but there are oftentimes, even as on a council, we will make policy and then it will go into some vault somewhere and we won't come back to it. As policymakers, we need to make sure if it's something that we want to change, where is that legislative calendar that's going to come back to us to say, how have we done on this? How are we grading our policies when we're making policy instead of just making policy and walking away from it?
The insight from an experienced policymaker. We have a couple more questions, and I'm not sure how we're doing on time. I think that this is a new subject matter topic, so I'm going to ask this question before I do a time check. And the question's on education. It's Tinsley on the Tinsley Transfer Program. The Tinsley Transfer Program was a band-aid to the regional inequity in educational funding that is long overdue for replacement. How can we address education more regionally rather than the status quo?
So can I say something about the Tinsley program? We need the people in Palo Alto and in other communities to stop acting as if the program is to help poor people. That is not the design of the program. The program was designed to have more diversity. And that is the fundamental problem with the Tinsley program. People have turned something that's supposed to be about equity into something that's supposed to be about equity into something that is charity. And when you feel that you can look down on people that you're supposed to be equal with because it's a charity, you have significant educational issues when you start talking about teachers and supervisors and people in the system and parents. When we're talking about equity, they're talking about charity. And this is it's so pervasive and it's so like digging and it does a disservice to our Black students. And it's absolutely, as we start reframing it, the first thing we have to say is this is not a charity program. This is because you have designed communities that are 1% Black, 4% Latino, and it is basically racist in your rules and structures, and we're trying to build diversity in it. It's not because we need charity. It's because we need you to actually treat human beings like human beings.
Reverend Kaloma, thank you so much for that. And just being from East Palo Alto, you know, when education should have equity in its basis. So I live here in East Palo Alto. Why is it that we have to go across the bridge to get a better education? We should be investing in our children and in our community to make sure that education is accessible and remove the barriers to education so that everybody has an equal footing.
And if I could add, I mean, as a council member, I'm not a school board member, but I think about Wi-Fi and how important that is and what we can do as a city to support that. I think about more housing so that we do have that equity and diversity throughout all our cities. And we are not required to create a program that matches different folks with different people. And so that's where I'm going to focus and work on.
So. Well, I want to thank you all. It's so hard to stop this conversation because I'm so grateful for you sharing your wisdom and your experience in these areas with us. At this moment, though, I've been told our time is up. And so with that, I'm going to pass the program back to Ms. Smith.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm overwhelmed. I'm humbled. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Storytellers, policymakers, thank you for the honest, open conversation, for the challenges, as someone said, for continuing the courageous conversation. There is still an opportunity, I think, for a few more questions and answers if there are questions in the chat or in the question and answer section. And then I will also then turn over this meeting to be summarized for storytellers by Julie and the policymakers summation by Ray. Any questions in any questions in our question answer? No questions? Then I will turn this over to Julie to surmise the conversation with our storytellers, and then she will in turn pass the baton to Ray.
Thank you, Olivette. I want to note that at the beginning of the event, it was suggested that I would summarize both. So I think that's still the case, but somebody should let me know right now if that's not true. I have got this page of notes. Okay, this is like my page of notes from what was just said. And I'm going to do my best to do justice here. And I know other people will be formulating questions as I do this. So first, I want to express the gratitude that has been coming in on the chat. People watching, we have over 200 people here. Grateful to be spending a Sunday afternoon in community with people who want to make our communities more hospitable, more equitable, more kind for everybody, including, of course, people of color who historically have been marginalized and mistreated here. Okay, so what I heard from Nathasha was the emotion of feeling, of just sharing these stories, surprised by her own emotion. She shared a very poignant example of being arrested as a child outside of a school dance when the white children who had also left the school dance were not arrested. The humiliation of those experiences lasts a lifetime potentially. And Nathasha doing the work of talking about it is a path toward healing. Let me invite everyone who's been a panelist to just be on the screen so we can see faces and whatnot as I go through these summaries. I heard Lucinda talk about a painful family incident this summer with a Black man whom her family had hired as a behavioral therapist to assist her autistic son, had the police called on him as he was walking down the street hand in hand with her autistic son. This was yet another Karen moment, as we might call it. Ethan, the wonderful Black man behavioral therapist, was so unfazed by it because it happens to him all the time. He didn't even mention it for a week. And Lucinda's question is, how can we find out who called? These people who are calling the police on our bodies need to be held to account. And this is a theme that continued to come up. Nehezi shared so many stories about coming to Menlo Park and assumptions being made the moment she moved here, such that she wrote an open letter on Nextdoor, this bastion of help, this bastion of hatred and bias. She wrote an open letter to Menlo Park and said, by way, I think, of an offering, of an example of how we can rise above it. We Black people, we all people, she said, when aggression meets me, I meet it with patience. And Nehezi, I want to learn that from you. I don't think I've gotten there yet. She said we need to open lanes to create wealth. We are 10 generations long, if not longer, she said, of folks who have been oppressed and prevented from merely participating in American society, its economy, its democracy. Terri Givens, who's the author of the forthcoming memoir, Radical Empathy, talked about the internalized oppression she experienced young, growing up in a mostly white town with parents who encouraged her to assimilate. She spoke of the divides and the divisiveness within Menlo Atherton, the public school in Menlo Park, or Atherton, I'm really not quite sure, which her two sons attend. She says, I'm fighting as a mother. It is frightening as a mother to have to worry about my sons. They shouldn't be punished or scrutinized or harmed for wearing a hoodie. Lisa Gauthier spoke of the death of George Floyd, bringing much needed attention to events that have been happening, of course, for decades. Her own son said, and this was so painful for so many of us to hear, those of us who have Black children, Lisa's son said, why did God make me Black? And I just want to pause and let every non-Black person listening just try to ingest that into your bones. What if your child was made to feel that way by the country, the state, the community, the neighborhood, the school they attend? Okay, if you are not Black, try to walk a mile, a day, a moment in our shoes. And imagine your child saying, why did God make me to look the way I do? People with disabilities can relate. People who belong to unpopular quote unquote religions can relate. Okay, people who are gender fluid can relate. Okay, this is what we deal with on a constant basis. She said, we need to make, she says to her son, I need you to make smart choices out there because I want you to come home. And as a policymaker, she encouraged us to have the real conversations and to build bridges. Moving on from Lisa Gauthier, we had Davina Hurt, who said just the most, I mean, right? Here she is, the mayor of Belmont, walking down the street, and someone on next door says, there's a Black lady walking around here I've never seen before. She's asked, don't you have to live in Belmont to be our mayor? Can you see the implicit bias? These people don't even realize how utterly racist their language and assumptions are. She reminds us that we have to function at 110% and yet don't talk about it. And yet here we are today. And Davina, we're glad you and your colleagues and our community members are here today talking about it. She asked us to think about how are we going to dismantle this without blowing up society, how to bring everyone along. She mentioned the issues are vast, including healthcare and the environment and housing. We moved on to Neysa Fligor, and Neysa said Los Altos has hardly any Black people, and folks have started showing up at city council meetings, and a lot of those folks have been students and young people. She spoke of their task force that has eliminated SROs in schools and working on implicit bias training in the police, and a whole lot of ideas coming out of Los Altos to try to transform its reality. And then we heard from the Reverend Kaloma Smith, who said it's a positive thing that we are peeling back the myth of these liberal communities that apparently have no racism. That is a myth. We're peeling that back. He said we need to stop assuming as policymakers and citizens and residents that Black and brown people are all broke, all needing something from the government, all involved with crime somehow. And if this is, of course, evoking the language of our former United States president, whom whenever he was asked about the Black community, spoke about crime and poverty and whatnot. Reverend Smith wants everybody to know the conversation needs to be much broader. He reminded us that churches have been defaced and that Black candidates for public office have had angry and harmful and hateful messages put in their lawns. He said we need radical transparency from police. We have to deal with the bad actors within the police departments, hold cities accountable. And we also, he reminded us, must deal with this phone violence, the people who would purport to harm our bodies, whether they intentionally do it or implicitly are doing it by calling the police because we are walking down the street. In summary, somebody on the chat said, I wish all council members of all of these cities were made to watch this, and I would ask the powers that be to try to make it so. This has been an incredibly rich conversation, just touching on the very tippity tops of the issues, folks. But if you dare to ask us what we experience, and we trust that you will do something with it, we will share. That time is now, and we are increasingly doing it. I will say that there seems to be a solution needed at the individual level. First and foremost, conversations within ourselves about whom am I implicitly negatively biased. We all contain negative biases within us. Read Jennifer Eberhardt's work. She's a professor at Stanford who's won the MacArthur Genius Award for her work on what implicit bias is. There's another author, Dolly Chugg, who's written The Person You Mean to Be. This sort of takes the research that Professor Eberhardt writes about, and she really operationalizes the solutions, what to do to undo the bias in your mind. Irshad Manji has written Don't Label Me. an incredible conversation for difficult times about how to talk about this stuff. We've got to have conversations to undo the biases in our own minds. We've got to have real conversations on our city councils and in our communities, our neighborhoods, and in our places of work and worship. We need to all speak up when we see it happening. We need to call out our neighbors who dare to say, there's a Black man walking down the street, is that okay? Next door needs to be a place where we can all feel safe and supported. We need to act at the community level, our schools, our teachers, our city councils, our law enforcement, our places of worship, okay? We need to be holding law enforcement accountable, undoing that bias that is within some of them towards some of us. Mayor Fligor, I want you to know that I have a friend in your town, Tony Mose, whose son, Keenan Mose, is a young Black man, and he was pulled over by the Los Altos police 17 times in the first 18 months in which he had his driver's license. Let us hear that again. It took the Los Altos police 17 stops before they realized, oh, one of our Black people has just been licensed to drive a car. Hear me now. No child in any community represented on this call should ever face that fear, driving a car to and from their own house. Let us commit as a community, not in our town. I've heard that we need better housing policies, better police policies, better policies around healthcare, better policies around the environment. Can we commit that we will create better spaces and places for ourselves and for our children? That's my wrap up. Back over to you, Ms. Olivette Smith.
What can I say? You said it all. Thank you all. Thank you for the bottom of our heart on behalf of the PDC and every member of our community. Yes, we can do better, and we will still rise, continue to shine our best. We know better, we do better. Thank you. Thank you all for your participation, your feedback. Julie, you were excellent. No, thank you. Thank you. Ooh.
Thank you.
Yes. Unbelievable, overwhelming, beyond my imagination. No, it wasn't about beyond my imagination.
Thank you everyone for all of this. I am here to plug our next event, which is on February 21st, talking about the promise of carbon neutrality by 2050. But that seems sort of secondary to what we just did here. So thank you everyone. Thank you, Julie, for hosting. I'm gonna go buy Dr. Givens' book, and I'm also gonna go buy Julie's book. So that's what I'm gonna do. I invite you all to join me in that. Thank you everyone so much. This is fantastic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.